Some say life begins at 60, others believe it starts at 50, or perhaps at 40. These phrases are repeated like cultural comforts, meant to soothe those who feel the weight of time on their shoulders. But is there true wisdom in these words, or are they merely attempts to find solace in the face of the struggles that define existence? Every stage of life is filled with hope. First, the anticipation of growth, then the pursuit of success, later the quest for stability. And then, when energy begins to fade, there's a desire to start anew, not out of obligation, but out of necessity. It's like a traveler who, realizing they've lost their way, searches for a shortcut to justify their journey. But time does not return what it has taken. This is the essence of the so-called midlife crisis. The realization that, despite all our efforts, life has not delivered what it promised. The long-awaited satisfaction was fleeting, goals faded faster than expected, and dreams may remain just out of reach, like a distant horizon. The midlife crisis is not a crisis in a pathological sense. Rather, it's a rare moment when a person, perhaps for the first time, looks at the world with disillusioned eyes. This loss of enchantment, however painful, can mark the beginning of something more authentic. Yes, youth has passed, and the energy of earlier years is no longer the same. But perhaps because of this, there's a chance to live with less haste, without the blindness of desire, free from the noise of societal illusions. Time reveals its truth, and with it, a previously unseen opportunity to live humbly, without unreasonable expectations, finding in this a higher form of freedom. If life begins at 60, it's not because it becomes better, but because we may have grasped its meaning. This understanding allows us to move forward more soberly, calmly, and truthfully. Humans are, by nature, creatures of desire. From the moment we become aware of ourselves, we project our happiness into the future, a future that always seems promising, even if it's endlessly delayed. For decades, existence is sustained by this illusion that at some point, everything will make sense, everything will fall into place, and suffering will give way to lasting contentment. But time moves forward impartially, and there comes a moment when this illusion begins to crumble, often in midlife. The veil hiding reality thins. Men and women, previously consumed by chasing goals, achievements, and approval, wake up to the unsettling realization that much of what they pursued was futile or, once attained, failed to satisfy. This is what's commonly called the midlife crisis, not an individual failure but an inevitable consequence of life's structure. It's about the collision between the blind, insatiable will and the reality of human limitations. Realizing that the time remaining is shorter than the time already lived, that what we avoided is unavoidable, that what we want is ultimately unsatisfying, and that the world, no matter how many incentives it offers, provides no true solace. Youth thrives on hope, but maturity demands clarity. This clarity is painful because it shatters the fragile foundation on which we build our idea of a fulfilling life. People launch new projects, chase new appearances, but such steps rarely bring lasting relief. They're merely temporary distractions from a truth that can no longer be ignored. Thus, the midlife crisis is not an abnormal interruption of life's path, but the flow of life itself, revealing its essence. It's a time when the mirror reflects not only a face marked by time, but also a soul marked by truth. This confrontation with reality offers the chance to find serenity. If we realize that the will can never be fully satisfied, we may begin to free ourselves from it. This voluntary renunciation, not of life, but of desire as the center of existence, may bring not euphoria but something more valuable: relief, calm, and acceptance. The practical wisdom is to expect less, desire less, and thus suffer less. For those who've reached midlife and feel the world no longer offers what it once promised, know that this feeling is not weakness, it's clarity. However bitter it may seem at first, it opens the door to a more conscious, peaceful, and truthful life. Throughout life, our identity is largely shaped by desires. We spend much of our time trying to answer the question, "Who am I?" Not through an unchanging essence, but through our social roles, the parts we play, and the goals we set. In youth and early adulthood, this identity feels solid. We are what we achieve, what we conquer. We invest in the idea that reaching certain milestones, career, marriage, children, a home, will make us feel complete. This is the project of the will, a blind impulse pulling us toward the future, always convincing us that the next step will bring the satisfaction we currently lack. However, there comes a moment when, faced with the passage of time, a person feels a strange unease. What once defined them no longer represents them. What seemed important now feels unnecessary. They begin to ask, who am I if everything I've built is impermanent? And even more unsettling, who am I if everything I wanted didn't bring the peace I hoped for? From this gap arises the midlife crisis, not just a reaction to physical aging, but a profound disruption of identity. To their surprise, a person discovers that what they thought was themselves was merely a reflection of the will, a will that is never satisfied, that consumes the present for a future that, once reached, is never enough. Schopenhauer reminds us that the will is the metaphysical essence of life. It drives us to want, seek, and strive. But if not understood, this force consumes us. For decades, under the sway of this blind will, we fail to see that all satisfactions are fleeting, and boredom or disappointment always returns. Midlife is the moment when the veil lifts, and the repetition of this cycle becomes clear. Many try to rebuild their identity, changing lifestyles, habits, or seeking new connections, attempting to rekindle the fire of youth. But these efforts often fail because the problem lies not in the external world but in the structure of the will that inhabits us. The real opportunity in this moment lies not in reinventing oneself as before, but in separating oneself from what was never essential. When a person gradually lets go of the illusion that their identity depends on achievements, they begin to approach a form of freedom not to do, but to be. This is the freedom of one who accepts the limits of existence and, through this, learns to live in the present with greater serenity. It's not about denying what has been lived, but recognizing that value now lies not in what was built, but in what is understood. Understanding oneself at this stage of life is perhaps the only truly lasting achievement. From a biological perspective, aging is an inevitable process of material decline. Nature, indifferent to our will, follows its course relentlessly, as it does with all that is born, grows, matures, and eventually decays. No philosophy, however optimistic, can deny the evidence of this physical decline. Senses slow, health becomes fragile. A person endowed with consciousness painfully observes these changes. They don't just age, they know they're aging, and this awareness makes the process even more difficult. What defines our existence is the constant attempt to deny the reality of finitude. For much of our lives, the body is an instrument of the will. Through it, we seek pleasure, power, and security. But with time, this instrument no longer responds as it once did. Vitality fades, and with it, the illusion that life is under our control. Many resist this, trying to preserve youth through artificial means, refusing to accept time's authority. But these efforts are futile. Time, as Schopenhauer noted, orders decay, gives it rhythm, but does not pause it. Yet, if youth is a time for action, old age can be a time for contemplation. When the body's strength wanes, a possibility not guaranteed, but possible opens for a clarity previously unattainable. While we are strong, we are immersed in the frenzy of doing, but in the stillness of aging, there's room to observe and reflect. It is in this quiet that true wisdom is sometimes born. Schopenhauer does not romanticize aging. He views it coldly, as part of the tragic structure of existence. But this is precisely why he offers a way to understand it. The body's decline can mark the decline of the will. As the will weakens, so do the torments of unfulfilled desires. There is no glory in physical decline, just as there is no glory in the illusions of youth. Both are phases of the same process. What distinguishes old age, if understood correctly, is the possibility of a less agitated, less noisy existence, less enslaved by desires. It's a time when we no longer seek to outwit the world but to understand it. The body, once a tool for restlessness, becomes a limit and, therefore, a sign of rest. Physical decline is not the end of human dignity. On the contrary, it is here that the value of consciousness is tested. Those who navigate aging without despair or delusion possess a rare form of strength, the strength of those who have learned to live with the inevitable. From an early age, we're immersed in a narrative about life, a script repeated across generations, as if human existence could be organized by a manual. Childhood as a time of innocence, youth a time of possibilities, midlife the productive peak, and old age a time for memories and rewards. This is the story we're told, but this construction serves society's need for order, not truth. To maintain this order, it creates myths, the myth of glorious youth, of professional success as a measure of value, of family as the redeemer of all suffering. We're taught to pursue these goals as if they guarantee fulfillment. A person who reaches middle or old age often realizes, through experience, that the world does not deliver what it promises. Even those who followed every step of the societal script often feel an emptiness, a mismatch between what they experienced and what they expected to find. Schopenhauer might say that suffering arises precisely from this illusion that the world was made for our happiness. The world, he insisted, is not a stage set to please us. It's the endless manifestation of a blind will, devoid of a higher purpose. Culture, in trying to order chaos, offers fragile comfort, which crumbles when reality imposes itself. As we age, we see clearly that much of what we pursued was vanity, imposed from outside. When we fail to meet these criteria, whether by choice or limitation, we're made to feel we've failed. But in truth, it's not failure. It's the first step toward freedom. The story we were told didn't account for inner peace, serene contemplation, or stepping away from the social race. It was written to keep us busy, active, productive, even when our soul craves something else. Only with time do we get the chance to see the error, not because we grow wiser, but because reality loses its gloss and reveals its true texture. What emerges is heavy but liberating. Happiness, as it was promised, never existed. True relief lies in expecting less, desiring less, seeing things as they are, not as they should be. This cultural deconstruction can be painful, but it's also a gift for those who navigate it with clarity. When illusions are shattered, what remains is not despair but sobriety, a more honest, cautious, and less painful way of living. The human condition is defined by a constant tension between desire and reality. Throughout life, this tension appears not only in personal desires, but in the obligations society imposes under the guise of morality, tradition, or good behavior. By midlife, a person is often caught in the middle. On one side, there are children who may still be emotionally or financially dependent. On the other, aging parents require care. A person is pulled in different directions, leaving little room for themselves. Often, without realizing it, they become an instrument for sustaining the will of others, a dual burden of altruism. From a philosophical perspective, we must ask, what remains for a person after years of selfless dedication to others' needs? Where is their peace, their quiet desire to rest, their need to be more than just a support? Schopenhauer teaches that desire is an insatiable force, a restless drive for pleasure and recognition. Society reinforces the idea that a person's value lies in how much they do for others, but this also perpetuates a cycle of self-destruction. The more you give, the more is demanded, until a person becomes a shadow of their former self. For example, caring for aging relatives is a natural act of compassion, but when that care becomes an all-consuming obligation, stripping away choice or rest, it becomes a prison. Similarly, children, even as adults, may continue to demand attention, resources, or presence, as if the role of a parent never ends. In such cases, a person no longer lives for themselves, their existence becomes an extension of others' needs. The cruelest part is that this often passes as virtue. Yet a life caught in this cycle yearns for stillness, contemplation, and reflection. Culture doesn't allow us to return to ourselves. It expects us to remain useful, available, active. Pausing is frowned upon, exhaustion is seen as weakness, and the desire for solitude is labeled as selfishness. But perhaps the true selfishness lies in feeding a system that drains people's vitality until nothing remains. In this context, midlife can be a turning point, a moment when you ask, have I lived for myself or only for others? If one has the courage to listen to this question honestly, they may realize it's time to reclaim their right to their own life. This doesn't mean abandoning responsibilities, but redefining them. True care begins with caring for oneself. The phrase, "life begins at 40, has become a popular slogan in recent decades. Some see it as opening new possibilities for reinvention, as if maturity brings not only wisdom, but a new existential strength. But if we view this idea philosophically, with honesty rather than hope, we must recognize it as another attempt by the will to stay active, even in the face of inevitable decline. For Schopenhauer, the will to life is an irrational force, constantly pushing us to move, search, and remain restless. It knows no peace because it's always projected into the future, always lacking, always wanting. When we reach midlife, we see that many projects remained unfulfilled, or the promises of youth went unmet. The will doesn't stay silent, it reinvents itself, creating new goals, new illusions, new beginnings. In this sense, the dream of a fresh start isn't necessarily freedom, it may be a new disguise for the same old mechanism. Faced with a reality that shows us time is limited, the body is changing, and opportunities are narrowing, the will crafts a story of starting over as a form of solace or salvation. Of course, one can change their life's direction at any age. It's even necessary to let go of what robs us of freedom and embrace what brings joy. But the idea that life begins at an arbitrary chronological point speaks more to a fear of endings than the start of something real. The true beginning of life, if we can call it that, doesn't lie in external achievements. It's not about changing careers, appearances, or reviving old projects in new forms. It happens when we realize the will cannot be satisfied and that we no longer need to blindly obey it. This realization leads not to passivity, but to liberation. By ceasing the relentless pursuit of future fulfillment, a person may, for the first time, become truly present, no longer at war with time, not in conflict with the past, but resting quietly in what is. Life doesn't begin at 40 or 60. It begins when we stop believing it needs to begin to have value. Schopenhauer would say that the value of existence lies not in what we achieve, but in how we face life's inevitable struggles. To age with dignity is not to remake oneself as if still young, but to recognize the greatness in accepting limits and finding peace in that acceptance. When time passes and life proves less generous than promised, many feel an emptiness. Projects are completed or abandoned, loved ones move on to their own paths, and an urgent need for self-realization arises. Modern society offers quick fixes for this sense of spiritual void. It subtly and persistently tells us that happiness can be bought, that a new outfit, a trip, a luxurious item, or an exotic experience can erase the discontent that midlife often reveals. People chase these things, hoping they'll lead to lasting satisfaction. But as Schopenhauer rightly noted, the pleasure of possession is always fleeting. The human will, by its nature, is insatiable. One desire is soon followed by another. The joy of acquisition gives way to boredom or disappointment. Thus, we fall into a cycle. Desire, acquire, disappoint. This cycle isn't a sign of personal failure, but an expression of existence's structure. The will drives us forward but offers no rest. It promises what it cannot deliver, pushing us to keep moving even when the body craves rest and the soul seeks stillness. Consumption, then, is not just an economic issue, it's an attempt to escape ourselves, to avoid facing the truth. We begin to understand this when obligations fade, when the rush slows, and we're left with only a mirror, one we can't always bear to look into. The problem isn't in the objects themselves or the occasional desire for comfort or pleasure. The problem is the illusion that these things can provide what no external condition can. Meaning. This is why, even with access to countless goods and stimuli, so many remain unsatisfied. Especially in maturity, when life's limits become undeniable. Schopenhauer's response to this dissatisfaction is not to chase more, but to desire less, to realize that relief comes not from possession, but from consciously letting go of expectations. Lasting satisfaction lies not in constant excitement, but in the calm that comes when we stop expecting the world to fulfill us. Maturity, in this sense, can be a time of freedom, when a person, tired of chasing promises of more, turns inward not as an escape but as a return, a reconnection with what remains when everything else fades. There's no need to reject small pleasures; they exist and have their place. But pinning hopes for happiness on them leads to disappointment. True solace lies in a sober life, in the simplicity of desires and clarity of thought. Life is hard enough without adding the false belief that happiness can be bought. Letting go of this belief may be the first step toward a lighter, calmer, and paradoxically more meaningful existence. Aging, though inevitable, is not a uniform event. Each person experiences it with a certain attitude, even if unconscious. This attitude, not gray hair or wrinkles, truly defines how we age. Schopenhauer, with his unflinching clarity, offers no comforting promises about old age. For him, physical decline is a natural process, but the suffering it brings can be eased through philosophical understanding. To age is to lose. You lose strength, vitality, and much of what fueled you for years. But this loss can also be a liberation from the enslavement of relentless desires. Youth is marked by the illusion that everything is possible. Maturity confronts us with the reality that we are not masters of time, the world, or our bodies. In this realization, paradoxically, a higher form of freedom is born, a freedom that comes from consciously letting go. We can choose how to age, but this choice isn't about appearance, productivity, or social approval. It's about the spirit, how we position ourselves in the face of what lies ahead. Some become prisoners of the past, living in memories, regrets, or nostalgia for what was or could have been. Others desperately cling to youth, as if they could reverse time's natural flow. Both suffer, not because they age, but because they resist reality. Each stage of life has its task. Youth demands action, building, and struggle. Maturity, on the other hand, calls for detachment, reflection, and acceptance. This is a difficult path because it requires letting go of what long defined us. But it's possible. Wisdom, Schopenhauer says, lies in recognizing existence's limits and, instead of fighting them, learning to live with them. The truly wise person doesn't overcome old age but understands it. To age serenely is to stop waiting, to stop demanding from life what it never promised. In this, we find something rare. Inner stillness. Not the absence of pain, but the absence of agitation. Not the absence of memories, but the absence of torment. Old age can thus become fertile ground for self-discovery, a time to be with oneself without haste, without masks, without the need to prove anything. In this stillness, we sometimes find the only possible peace. The peace that comes when we stop wanting life to be different and accept it as it is. Reaching maturity means passing through the fog of illusions to find, on the other side, the real landscape of existence, one built not on promises, but on acceptance, not on what you can still achieve, but on what you no longer need to desire. If there have been disappointments, and there surely have, let them be a reason not for regret, but for enlightenment. Every time reality disrupted our plans, it was merely doing its job, showing us that life wasn't made to fulfill desires, but to be lived with dignity. Schopenhauer said, "Life swings like a pendulum between pain and boredom." This realization, however harsh, is liberating when understood correctly. It invites us to let go of expecting constant happiness, freeing us from the burden of chasing it. For those in the second half of life, weary of the world's demands, philosophy offers not just comfort but an honest proposal: to live soberly, to see the remaining time not as a final race but as a chance to be still, to contemplate, to simply be. The culture around us persists in selling ideas of new beginnings, rejuvenation, and rebirth. But not all paths lead to external transformation. The transformation that matters happens when we stop wanting life to be different. Peace arises not from accumulating experiences, but from accepting limits. The true merit of old age is not in staying young, but in realizing that youth is gone, and with it, the turmoil of the will. What remains may be more valuable than all that was lost. Time to observe, to think, to exist, without haste. This isn't about glorifying suffering or denying possible joys. It's about removing the veils to see life clearly, without embellishments, illusions, or the constant need for more. In this, we find a form of peace, perhaps austere, but authentic. Old age, if embraced consciously, can be a return to oneself, not to the self the world shaped, but to the one that was always silent, waiting to be heard. This reconnection, quiet and unseen, may finally give meaning to the remaining days. If youth is a time for searching, let old age be a time for understanding. And if there's anything left to desire, let it be not the extension of pleasure but the relief of burdens, the lightness of living with what is, being who you are, expecting nothing more than what's possible. In the end, when we stop expecting everything from life, we begin to see the little it offers as enough. In the precise balance between what you lose and what you accept lies what so many seek but few find, a moment of true peace. If these reflections resonate with you, enjoy the video, subscribe to Senior Health Library, and turn on notifications to receive more stories and reflections like this. This way, you won't miss any new content. Stay well, and see you next time.